Hey everybody, welcome back to the Rule Your Pool podcast. I am your host, Eric Knight, and with me as usual, my co-host, Jared Morgan. Jared, thanks for being here.
Well, I'm glad to be back. I know we had a fill-in for the last couple of episodes, but I'm very disappointed to miss it, but I'm here today.
Well, you are. And today is episode 11, and we are talking about winterization because it's November and winter is coming. In fact, in some parts of the country, it's already here. And so the takeaways from today's episode are the temperature swings that you experience in your area are going to determine how you have to winterize your pool. People in northern Michigan are going to have to winterize a little different than where I am in the Carolinas. The second takeaway is the type of cover you have actually matters more than the type of surface. Now, there's different consequences to different surfaces like cement-based pebble, quartz, plaster, etc., versus a liner or a fiberglass. But the type of cover, i.e. mesh versus solid, or mesh maybe no cover versus solid, that actually has a bigger impact on your winterization procedure. So let's get right into it. I mean, this should be a pretty short, simple episode.
It should be short. What I would like to touch on is when we're referring to winterizing your pool, for those of us in, Southern California, Arizona, Texas, Florida, we don't really close or winterize pools per se. Pretty much it's Midwest, Northwest that's closing a pool down. And when we're talking about closing a pool, it's closing with the cover, getting all the leaves out, getting your chemicals balanced and adjusted, winterizing the plumbing so that nothing freezes or freeze damage doesn't occur when winter's happening. So this is what we're talking about. And what we're going to talk about specifically today is the chemical and, the aspects that those play in damaging or potentially damaging surfaces, I'm assuming, and the right things to do.
Yeah. And by the way, closing itself, you could still have your pool open and circulating in some of those areas, but the temperature still drops. So let's get right into it. This is episode 11 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. Let's go. Welcome to Rule Your Pool, the podcast by Orenda that explains and simplifies pool chemistry so that anybody, regardless of experience, can understand it. I'm your host, Eric Knight, bringing clarity to these subjects so that you can bring clarity to your water. If you're ready to rule your pool, then let's go. Okay, so Jared, you live in Texas. What is the coldest temperature that your pool could potentially get? And I'm talking water temperature.
Water temperature generally hovers around 40 degrees. It's very
the coldest. Cold. So yes. Like in January, 40 degrees.
Yeah, and I'm in North Texas too. So it can get colder in other places, but where we are, it's about 40.
And you, I presume, have a thermometer in your pool that tells you that?
I do. I have an automated system that tells me my temperature, which is great. But yeah, I have a thermometer. Okay.
So that brings up an interesting point right there that I want to tackle before we get into the winterization procedure. Your automated thermometer is great when it's circulating water, but it's really telling you the temperature of the water in your plumbing. I want to know what is the temperature in the vessel. And so what we often recommend at Orenda, and I'm glad you bring this up, is we recommend having an analog thermometer, if nothing else, as a double check. Put it in your skimmer and then dangle it into your pool when you're there, just so you know the temperature. The thing is less than $10, but it's really, really accurate. It's just a thermometer, no batteries required. But knowing the temperature, especially in the coldest parts of your winter, is a big advantage. And, because the water gets colder in the northern climates, you might think that they're at more risk, and in some ways they are, of pool damage in the winter because, as we know, cold water lowers the LSI, which we discussed in previous episodes. But they almost have an advantage because your pool's not going to freeze in Texas, is it?
No, it's not. And you bring up a good point that I'm relying on my temperature sensor, and I'm assuming it's working and calibrated properly too.
Yeah, well, you are, but
having a backup is a good idea.
Yeah, but furthermore, you don't know what the worst case scenario is. You could have a really mild winter or you could have a harsh winter and you don't know. Could it be 40? It maybe could be 48 one winter.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's actually an advantage to be in a place that it's guaranteed it's going to freeze. Northern Pennsylvania, New York, upstate, all of New England, Michigan, etc. guarantee the pool is going to freeze. So you don't have to worry about it because you know what the worst case scenario is. And that is what's going to drive your winterization procedure. So there are two sides to winterization. There is balance, LSI balance, which is what we're going to focus on in this episode. And there's also keeping the water clean. I would normally say sanitization, but it's really more of prevention to keep the water clean while it's closed up for the winter time. So let's focus on balance, and that's really the LSI. The key here, if you're going to write anything down from this episode, is proper winterization keeps your LSI balanced all winter long. That's the bottom line. If you know that your pool is going to freeze, use the Orenda app. It's free. Drop that temperature down to 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius for our friends in Canada listening to this. Drop it down to freezing. See what that does to the chemistry. Now your question is, how do you get that number at freezing temperature to be balanced on the LSI? We're going to get into a little bit of nuance between the two types of covers, meaning solid covers versus mesh, or no cover in that case, because they have different environmental factors that can change that chemistry over the winter. But the point remains the same. Whatever your worst case coldest temperature is going to be, you have to be in the green on the LSI at that temperature. Jared, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and just kind of back to the whole LSI conversation and people's perception of calcium in the water. It's something that we obviously preach and talk about all the time is don't be afraid of higher calcium levels, which I know we're going to touch on. But I just had a customer this week send me an email because I recommended he closed his pool at 450 to 500 parts per million calcium. And he went to his local pool store and he sent me an email back and said, hey, my local pool store said that if I closed my pool that high, I'm going to have scale. And how
many times have we heard that?
And don't get me wrong, trust me, I didn't know it before we got into the deep dive on the LSI, but it's just, hey, yeah, we all have to understand that as this temperature goes down, something has to compensate for it.
You're absolutely right. And this is not a knock on any of the pool stores or any of the pool professionals that didn't realize the impact of temperature, because just like you said, until we created the LSI calculator, we didn't understand the impact of temperature until you could see it. So it's not an indictment on anybody. But I mean, Jared, let's be honest, how many calls do we get where we're giving conflicting information to the pool store because we know more about the LSI?
Absolutely. And it's part of our whole motto here is changing the way the world thinks about water. I mean, there's a lot that goes into balancing water. And we are just as guilty as the next person on learning something every day. And hopefully we try to pass that message on to everybody else. And hopefully it just spreads that way. But one at a time.
We don't own any of this information. We're here to share it and simplify it so that you can understand it, but we don't own any of the information. So that being said, this whole thing started, I guess 3 years ago now, and I'm with a customer in Pennsylvania, and they have scale. Scale every spring. They open up and there's scale. And they start showing me photos of this, and it doesn't seem like scale. And at the time, we had the calculator out for, 6 months, and we knew a lot more about temperature. Thinking, man, scale doesn't form in cold temperature very easily. How do you get the LSI to go on our app purple? The number turns purple if it's scale forming. How do you get the LSI that high when the temperature is that low? Well, the answer is you don't. You'd have to you could, but you'd have to really, really try hard. And they certainly didn't. And so because they thought it was scale, and by the way, this is like everybody in the Northeast, not just this company, because they thought they were looking at scale when they would open up in the spring and there's white stuff everywhere, sharp little crystals. They're like, oh, well, we have too much calcium going into the wintertime. Wrong takeaway. You didn't have nearly enough. And therefore it was stealing calcium from the surface. And we'll do a whole episode on crystals. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. But the point is, you got to think of a winterized pool kind of like a hibernating grizzly bear. You have to feed that bear before it hibernates. Otherwise, it's going to wake up and it's going to be hungry. And it's going to be pissed off. And so what's it going to do? It's going to look for calcium anywhere it can find it. And of course, in a cement-based pool, it's everywhere. In an all-tile pool, it's in the grout. So actually, I had a call yesterday from a pool that's all marble tile, and which is rare, by the way, but all marble tile. But On all the grout, they had little sharp white crystals. Not on the marble, just the grout, which tells me that's an etching problem. So you have to have enough calcium saturation, and that's what really leads into why the type of cover you have actually matters. So the bottom line is LSI balance in the winter means you have to have enough of it to get through the winter. So there's really two categories I want to divide here. The solid covered pools, which means no rain and snow can get in and no air can escape. And then the mesh or no covered pools, which means, rain and snow can eventually get in and air can also escape the pool. Two huge aspects of this.
What percentage do you think are solid covers versus mesh?
I have no idea. I was researching this blog that I'm currently writing now, and it'll be published by the time this podcast is out. But I was talking to Mako covers and Loop Lock and Latham and a bunch of these other companies. I have no idea what it is because they all sell so many of them. It could be 50-50. I mean, irrelevant. What matters is whoever's listening to this, just know what type of cover you have. If it's porous or not, if it lets water in or out, that's what really matters here. Where are you going with that, Jared?
I was going to assume. I just didn't know if you had the direct answer. Most of them are probably mesh covers.
It could be. I mean, the one I just did last week was solid. So
yeah, that's what I'm saying. I didn't know. In your journey of research, did you have this?
So, okay. Anyway, which one do you want to start with? Solid or mesh, Jared?
Let's go with mesh.
Okay. Mesh covers, you have to winterize with more calcium than you think because rain and snow, Jared, what's the calcium hardness in rain?
That's a good 0.
Oh, yeah. And snow too, because it precipitates from the sky. So it's basically distilled water. Rain and snow have 0 calcium. They are extremely aggressive on the LSI. And depending on where you live, acid rain could be a thing. Not everywhere, but I've seen pHs range on rainwater quite a bit, actually, which is surprising. But calcium doesn't range at all. It's always 0 parts per million. That is going to dilute your pool if you have a mesh cover or no cover at all. Rain and snow will get into that water and it will dilute your number down. So if you winterize at, say, 300 parts per million and your pool is going to be in a cold climate, 40 or below or whatever, you're not going to have 300 when you open up in the spring. It could be 250. It could be even 200. It could be diluted by half if you have enough that it triggers an overflow or whatever else. A lot of winterized pools will actually lower their water level below the return inlets so that they can blow the water out of those lines. And then they just let it kind of refill from rain and snow. Well, of course, you're going to have an LSI violation if you have 2 feet of water that came from the sky and diluted that number down. So the key here is you have to really overfeed that water with calcium. And you don't necessarily have to worry about pH, though, with mesh covers or no covers, thanks to Henry's Law, which we discussed earlier, I think in one of the first 3 episodes, about how carbon dioxide is going to equalize with the air above it. That's one advantage you have with a mesh cover. CO2 can escape. So as long as it doesn't etch, your pH is going to naturally rise up to its ceiling, which is typically about 8.2. And that's to your advantage. So take your temperature down on the Orenda app, drop it all the way down to its coldest possible point. In most cases, we're talking freezing here. Drop it down to that temperature and put the pH up to 8.2. You're going to realize it's not an insane number of calcium that you need, but I will tell you with mesh covers, if your pool freezes, 2 years ago, we thought, bare minimum 400 calcium, right? Remember that, Jared?
Mm-hmm.
That's before we were thinking about dilution. We're learning as we go as well, but because because rain and snow have 0 calcium hardness, you need more calcium to winterize because that number is just going to go down. That's why we now say for mesh covers in a climate that's going to freeze, you want more than 500, more like 500 to 600 calcium hardness. Don't freak out about high numbers because the dilution will bring it down. And knowing the LSI, you can maintain higher numbers. You could have 450 in the summertime in Pennsylvania and have no issues. You don't have to scale those pools. There's different strategies that you can maintain. So you need more calcium, but understand that your pH, if you do it right, is going to naturally rise up. What you want to avoid is undersaturating it so that it etches some of the cement, in which case it pulls 12.6 pH calcium hydroxide out, and that's what spikes your pH. So if you've ever come back to your pool and you open it up and the pH is off the charts, like super, super high, you know that you didn't have enough calcium in that pool.
Well, I touch base and say, we say it every day. If the worst thing that we did over the wintertime was scaled a pool, we have no issues.
We win.
We fix scale.
Yeah, we win, man. That's great. You win the prize. Because that's like, it's almost like a shield. It's like you just put a little bit more fat on that whale before it went into the wintertime, right? You just had more insulation than you needed.
I mean, our chemicals, there's other chemicals on the market. We're not the only ones that control scale buildup on surfaces. So, and that comes off very easily. But unfortunately, we cannot put etched cement back into the plaster.
Yeah, I mean, and crystals, depending on the type of crystal you have, we know of at least 4 different types. We think there's more. 2 of them, they're really easy to get rid of. 2 of them, they're very hard, like almost impossible. Some that you have to like physically drain the pool and grind them off with a diamond pad. That, I don't know why those form versus others, but we do know that all of these crystals form in cold, stagnant water because of an LSI violation. We want to prevent that. So if you do actually get some scale in the wintertime, don't panic. It's very easy to clean up in the springtime. So that's kind of one of the takeaways here is air high. If you're going to air anywhere, always air high, because you just don't know how much dilution you're going to get. I live in Charlotte, and every November and December, we get so much rain here that, the summer is pretty much a drought, but we get a ton of rain. I don't know how many inches that would be in a swimming pool, but consistently it's raining at least 2 days a week throughout November. And I remember this because I was having some yard work done and it was just muddy the entire November. So depending on where you live, keep that into consideration. And if you get one of these hurricane storms, that counts too. I know that doesn't typically go north, but rain has 0 calcium in it. So that's a mesh cover. Solid covers are a little different because they don't allow rain and snow into your pool. But on the flip side of that, they also don't allow carbon dioxide to escape, and therefore the pH that you close with is pretty much going to be the pH that you open with unless it etches. So if you don't have enough calcium in there for the coldest temperature, it's going to etch and you're going to have a sky-high pH and all bets are off anyway. These solid covers are the ones where you see things like winter dust, where the water etches and etches and etches as it gets colder because it's trying to equalize the LSI. Well, it finally gets to its lowest temperature, let's say second week of December, okay? And it's in LSI harmony at that point, but it etched its way there. Up until, late February, then it starts to warm up in March. Well, you were satisfied on the LSI at 32 degrees or at the bottom of the temperature, whatever it is. The temperature starts going up. By the time you get there in late April to open up the pool, it could be a 30-degree difference from the coldest. You know what I'm talking about, Jared. Like you could be there, it'd be 60 degrees when you start opening it up. That's a huge difference on the LSI. So what happened was you were balanced at the coldest temperature, but now that the temperature's gone up 30 degrees, water can't oversaturate itself, but the temperature can sure change. So it does. And now you have an LSI scale forming condition and it starts precipitating dust everywhere. And that's what winter dust is. So we've seen this before. It is more common with solid covers than mesh, but I've seen it happen on mesh covers too. So the consequences for these cement-based finishes, crystals or dust or whatever, you just have to know which type of strategy you're going to do based on the cover you have. But here's the thing, Jared. I don't care if you have a vinyl liner pool or a fiberglass pool. You still need to winterize with LSI in mind based on the water temperature and the cover you have. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Closing a pool down, a lot of people have the idea of dropping the pH low and superchlorinating to, get it ready for the wintertime. What is the ideal pH, do you think, for closing?
Depends on when you close, but honestly, if you're about to close up, then as long as you don't etch and you don't overcorrect, your pH is going to rise naturally on a mesh or uncovered pool. It's going to get up to its ceiling. So it doesn't matter where you close it. I don't know why you would add acid at all. If you're on a solid cover, you definitely don't want to go too low because you're going to need that higher pH in the wintertime.
Well, I'm getting calls right now and people are asking me what chemistry should they close their pool at, and I'm steering them towards 7.6, 7.7 at closing.
Yeah, that's fine. Or 7.8. I mean, we just winterized a pool. The only reason we had to lower the pH at all was to get the cal hypo in solution. That was the only reason. So we lowered the pH and then we added the cal hypo for the shock, but that was a temporary thing. And we did not add a lot of acid. So it was a vinyl liner pool. But that's a great question because these winterization kits give you parameters that you're supposed to hit as if you can maintain a 7.4 pH, throughout the winter. That's ridiculous. That's not going to happen. In a solid cover pool, though, theoretically, if you had enough calcium hardness, it could happen because CO2 cannot escape. So you got to, there's factors here. It's the type of surface you have, but really it's the type of cover you have. And my last takeaway on this is the consequences vary. We talked about the winter dust and the crystals on cement-based pools, and of course the spiking pH. What about vinyl liner and fiberglass pools? What consequences happen during the winter there? Jared, do you know of any?
I know wrinkling and fading.
Wrinkling might be one of them. Wrinkling is kind of tough. I'm not sure we can speak to that because that happens for a variance of reasons, but certainly fading of vinyl liners happens almost always during the wintertime. People think it's from overchlorination. No, that's not true. It's an LSI violation. What about fiberglass?
Gel coat problems?
Yep. You ever heard of chalking? Mm-hmm. Chalking is, we're also doing some research on this now. Everyone thinks it's scale. I know we sure did. It sure looks like scale, but it's not. Chalking is when your fiberglass pool just starts looking hazy and lighter and white. And what that is an LSI violation breaking down the gel coat because, again, water's blind and it's starving for calcium. So it's just digging. It's looking for calcium anywhere it can find it. And since you didn't feed it on winterization, it's attacking your gel coat, hoping there's calcium on the other side. I mean, that's not a chemical perfect explanation, but it's a good visual. So it's going to break down the gel coat. And once you break through that gel coat, it starts to get oxidized by chlorine. Now, that doesn't really happen very fast when the temperature's cold, but it happens really easily in the springtime because as the water heats up and you start chlorinating again, that gel coat is compromised. Boom. You start getting oxidized gel coat, and that actually turns white. It depends. There's different polymers. There's different things in these gel coats. But the point is, by and large, chalking or hazing of these fiberglass pools is an LSI violation. And it's not a good one. You can't undo it. So I think we've covered everything we need to for the balance of a winterization, haven't we?
I think we have, and I think we still stand behind our message that the majority of the surface damage occurs over the wintertime. So this is a very important time to not neglect it. And even if you don't per se close a pool down, like I said, Arizona, California, Texas, Florida, these customers and homeowners that go off a service over the wintertime to save some money and think that they're just going to maintain it themselves through their normal regimen of maintaining a pool like they do in the summertime, damage is still occurring. So it's very important to follow the LSI during the winter, cold months and sell that as a service to your customers of, hey, I am going to balance this thing the proper way and make sure that I minimize any potential surface damage because as the temperature goes down, that's when most of it happens. So use it as an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Well, to expand upon that, the companies that have the most success with winterization, at least following our program, are the ones that have introduced a winter watch kind of program. They may not have had it before. Some of them already did. But all you're doing is checking the temperature with an analog thermometer or a temperature pen, just something that's not in the plumbing, but actually the pool. Check the temperature, check the calcium hardness, check the pH, check the alkalinity. raise the calcium hardness as necessary. You almost never have to raise alkalinity or pH in a pool because, again, the pH is going to rise naturally through off-gassing unless you have a solid cover. But it's almost always calcium that the water is going to need. So calcium is your best friend. Use it regardless of the surface type that you have. Don't be afraid of higher calcium. So in a short recap for balance, mesh covers, you're going to want, if your pool freezes, 500 to 600 calcium hardness. Again, that will dilute down to probably just below 400 after winter if you have a mesh cover. If you have a solid cover, you're going to want about 400 to 500, depending on how cold your temperature gets. Don't be afraid of going higher, but you don't necessarily need to because you don't have to contend with dilution. But apart from that, that's pretty much the name of the game is LSI balance. So find out what parameters work for you. If you have a solid cover, you don't get the benefit of dilution for things like cyanuric acid. If you had a trichlor pool, your cyanuric acid is not going to get diluted by rain, whereas a mesh cover pool, that's awesome. You reduce your TDS, you reduce your cyanuric acid just via dilution. You don't have that benefit. So keep that in mind. You have to put those factors into the Orenda app to get a real picture of how much calcium you need. Because if you had 100 CYA, you're going to need more than 450 calcium in a solid cover pool because you don't have that dilution. So keep that in mind. As a final note here, we just covered, 90% of this episode was about water balance, and that's really what the topic was. Just as a bonus, how do you prevent it from flipping and, I don't want to say turning green, but really turning brown and disgusting during the wintertime? Jared, what do you recommend on closing? Because these closing kits contain things like algicides and antifreeze and all sorts of things.
I mean, mainly it's number one, getting as much of the debris and stuff out of the pool and keeping it that way as long as possible. But we always, tell people close with enzymes. Even though the water temperature is going down, it still will help as the temperature goes up with non-living organic management and making that water as efficient as possible. And as we're adding water in the springtime and so forth, we're definitely going to want to work in a stain, metal control, and things like that.
But that's in offset. The spring. That's in the spring, not in the winter.
No, not in the winter. We don't generally recommend our product, at least. I can't speak for others, but we generally do not recommend it in the wintertime. And if you do put it in, I always tell customers, hey, get the product SC1000 in the water at least 2 to 3 weeks prior to closing, so that when you do close it, you can get the water balanced where you want it.
Yeah, well, that's because the temperature won't allow it to activate. So it's pretty useless. Unless you're adding calcium that gets really hot when you pre-dissolve it, you add, a tablespoon of SC1000, pre-chelate that calcium. That's smart because it's plenty hot. It's going to activate just fine. That's a smart procedure. If you're adding calcium, just put the SC1000 in the hot calcium. Otherwise, you put it in 60-degree water or colder, it's not going to do anything. So
it'll do something, just not the way it's supposed to.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not going to let go, but it's also not going to activate very well. And that goes for, as far as I know, every sequestering agent. It's not a knock on any product. It's just every chemistry slows down when the water temperature gets lower. Phosphate removal is another thing that you can do, but you shouldn't do it on closing day because the precipitate is going to fall out and it's just going to make a mess. So you have to clean that out. So do that at least a week or two beforehand. But the final thing I want to talk about is clean the surface of your cover off periodically. If it gets buried in leaves, especially a mesh cover, it becomes almost like a tea bag that, rain and snow will take tannins from these leaves and it'll actually just go and bleed into your water and your water will be brown and it can stain with organic stains. Enzymes can help with tannins, but they can't do it all, especially when the water's really, really cold. So do your part, get a leaf blower, keep the cover clean periodically, get those leaves off of there, get the pine needles off. Pine needles, I learned, are pretty acidic, so they'll actually lower the pH in a mesh cover. So just keep these things in mind. Keep the cover clean. Those are some best practices. For more information, go to procedures.orendatech.com. That's procedures.orendatech.com. We have our winterization and our spring opening procedure in there. So all that information is available online. Thank you. This has been episode 11 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. Winter is coming. Jared, is there any final thoughts?
Nope, think we've covered the bases here. I appreciate everybody for listening. And if you, like I said, have any questions, feel free to reach out to us in a number of ways.
Yeah, we're all over social media. So anyways, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening to Rule Your Pool, a podcast by Orenda Technologies. For more information on what we discussed in this week's episode, check the links in the description or visit www.orendatech.com.
I hope you find this show valuable enough that you tap that subscribe button and share it with your friends. You can also like us on Facebook and social media. And with our help, you'll be able to rule your pool without over-treating it with chemicals and wasting money. I'll see you next episode.